There's a particular kind of silence that fills an old house on a gray morning. The kind of silence where you can hear the wood settling, the walls remembering all the years they've stood, the dust moving through shafts of weak sunlight. Margaret had inherited that silence along with everything else. The furniture, the photographs, the weight of family memory that no one really wanted anymore. She stood in front of the dresser in her mother's bedroom, or what used to be her mother's bedroom, running her fingers along the beveled edge of the drawer. The wood was warm beneath her palms, despite the cool air. Everything here was old. Everything here was heavy with time. The drawer itself was nothing remarkable. Oak, probably from the early 1940s, with brass handles that had tarnished to a dull bronze. Margaret had pulled it open 100 times before, or so she thought, searching for scarves, old photographs, jewelry that might be worth something. Each time she found the expected things. Handkerchiefs folded into perfect squares. A pearl brooch that had lost its luster. Letters tied with ribbon, their edges yellow to the color of old teeth. But this morning, as she reached toward the back of the drawer, her hand caught on something sharp. A splinter, she thought at first, a nail that had worked its way loose over decades. She pulled her hand back and frowned. Blood pooled in a small half-moon cut on her index finger. That's when she really looked. There was something unusual about the back panel of the drawer. She'd never noticed it before. But then again, she'd never looked closely. The wood grain didn't match. It was subtly different, a slightly different shade, the lines running in a different direction, as if someone, at some point in time, had carefully replaced this section. The realization arrived slowly, like a photograph developing in solution. Someone had deliberately altered this drawer. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide something behind that seemingly ordinary piece of wood. Margaret was 34 years old. She worked as an archivist at a university library, which meant she spent her days cataloging forgotten things people left behind, journals, photographs, documents that no one else cared about anymore. She was trained to notice inconsistencies, to understand that objects carried stories if you knew how to read them. But nothing in her professional training had prepared her for the feeling that gripped her chest as she stared at that drawer. It wasn't anticipation, exactly. It was something darker, something that whispered, "Some things are hidden for a reason." Her mother had died 8 months ago. Heart attack, sudden. The kind that leaves no time for goodbyes or explanations or final conversations about the secrets kept in Oldwood. Margaret was sorting through what remained, the accumulated debris of a full life lived quietly, carefully, with deliberate compartmentalization. Her mother had been a private woman, not cold precisely, but contained. She smiled rarely. She spoke even more rarely. Margaret had grown up in a house where questions were gently but firmly discouraged, where you learned early that some topics were simply not discussed. She should have called someone, a contractor, maybe, someone whose job was to deal with old mysteries hidden in old furniture. Instead, she found a screwdriver in the kitchen drawer, the same kitchen where her mother had made the same meals for 40 years, where every gesture was habitual, every movement carved by repetition into something almost sacred. She climbed back upstairs. The house seemed to watch her. Stairs creaked under her feet, like warnings. The wood came away in splinters. It was old, brittle, unwilling to surrender its secrets easily. Margaret worked with archaeological patience, carefully removing nail by nail, piece by piece, trying not to damage whatever lay behind. Her hand shook slightly. She told herself it was the dust, the physical effort of the work. But it wasn't. It was fear. Pure, nameless fear of what you might discover when you decide to disturb the carefully maintained architecture of family history. Behind the wood was an envelope, not several envelopes. One. A single envelope made of heavy cream-colored paper, the kind they used in the past for letters that mattered. There was a name written on it in handwriting Margaret recognized immediately. Her mother's careful, precise script. But the name wasn't hers. It read, "For Thomas, if you ever come looking." Margaret sat down on the bedroom floor. The afternoon light had shifted, moving across the hardwood in a slow arc. She held the envelope without opening it. Her mother's death had been 8 months ago. Before that, her father had died 16 years ago, a man Margaret had barely known, who had stayed largely absent even when present, who had spoken to her perhaps 1,000 words over the course of her childhood, and those words had been mostly instructions or corrections. She had never questioned this arrangement. Children don't question what they've never known to be different. Thomas was her older brother. Thomas, who had left home at 17 and never come back. Thomas, who had made it clear in a single brief telephone call to their mother, a call Margaret had not been allowed to take, that he was not interested in family contact. Thomas, who had become as much a ghost in family conversation as the people in old photographs gradually fade from memory. Margaret opened the envelope. The letter inside was several pages long, written in the same precise script. The handwriting grew shakier as it progressed, as if her mother had written it over several days in different emotional states. She began reading, and with each sentence, the world she thought she knew began to reorganize itself into a different configuration. Each word was another brick removed from a wall she had never known was there. "Dear Thomas," the letter began, "I have written this letter 17 times. I have burned 16 versions because I could not find words that would make you understand. I am attempting one final time, knowing that you may never read these words, but needing to make the attempt regardless. A mother's obligation extends beyond death. I believe, or perhaps I simply could not bear to leave this world without you knowing the truth of why you had to leave." Margaret's breath came shallow. She had never known that Thomas had to leave. She had been told he chose to leave, that he was willful and difficult, and made decisions that the family could not support. She had internalized this narrative without questioning it, the way children do. She continued reading. "You were not wrong about what you saw. You were not imagining things. And I should have protected you, but I was afraid. I was so afraid, Thomas. I was afraid of what would happen if I told the truth. I was afraid of scandal, of disruption, of becoming a woman who could not manage her own family's private affairs. I was afraid that your father would use your knowledge as a weapon against me, against you, against all of us. So I made you the sacrifice instead. I sent you away and called it your choice, and I have spent every day since then trying to absolve myself of that act by burying the truth as deep as I could bury it. I hid the evidence. I created versions of events that made sense only if you were understood to be troubled, difficult, a problem that needed to be removed. And I knew that every word of this was a betrayal of you. But I did it anyway." Margaret read the letter 3 times. She did not move from the floor. The light changed. The house settled around her like a body learning to breathe differently. By the time she reached the final page, she understood that she had never known her mother at all, that the woman she had grown up believing in, organized, proper, controlled, above reproach, was actually someone far more complicated. Someone who had made a choice to protect a system rather than protect a child. Someone who had lived with that choice for 40 years, carving into the interior of her own chest, where it festered and grew and became impossible to ignore. The letter described things Margaret could barely comprehend. Her father, drunk and violent and full of rage that had nowhere to go except into the people closest to him. Her mother, trying to manage that rage, making deals with herself about what she could accept and what she could change. And Thomas, for years older than Margaret, sensitive, frightened, catching her father in a moment she was not supposed to see, a moment that would have required someone to acknowledge what was really happening in their carefully maintained home. Thomas had threatened to tell someone, to break the silence. And her mother, faced with the choice between believing her child or protecting her marriage, had chosen her marriage. She had sent Thomas away to boarding school, then further away to college, and had made it clear that if he ever came back, if he ever spoke of what he'd seen, there would be consequences. He had never come back. Margaret found a telephone number written in pencil on the back of the final page. It had been there for at least 30 years, maybe longer. The pencil marks were faint but still legible, as if her mother had written it down and then erased it partially, unable to decide whether to preserve it or destroy it. She sat there, holding this number that was probably obsolete, that had certainly changed hands many times over, that may have belonged to a man who had worked very hard to ensure he could never be reached by his family. She looked around the bedroom. Everything in it suddenly seemed different. The carefully arranged furniture, The fresh flowers her mother had placed on the nightstand every morning regardless of season. The wall of books she had read in the evenings while Margaret's father snored downstairs. All of it took on the character of a performance. All of it became evidence of a woman constructing a life that could be maintained only through strategic forgetting. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She did not seal it. She did not hide it again. Instead, she left it on the dresser, in plain sight, as if her mother had finally decided to stop hiding things. Then she went downstairs to the kitchen, where the afternoon was becoming evening, where the light through the windows had turned a particular shade of gold that made everything look both beautiful and temporal. She made herself tea. She sat at the kitchen table where her mother had made the same movements 10,000 times. And she thought about the ways that silence is passed down through families like genetics, the way it becomes embedded in the cells, and the breathing patterns and the ability to speak difficult truths. Her father had died of a stroke at the age of 63. He had been slumped in his office chair, apparently in the middle of writing something, when her mother had found him. Margaret had been in her late teens. She had not mourned him particularly. She had not even been especially sad. She had simply accepted his absence the way she accepted everything, as inevitable as not to be questioned. Only now, reading her mother's words, did she understand that her father's death had probably felt like a kind of liberation for her mother. The silence would have ended then. The truth could have been told. But perhaps by that point, the silence had become so integrated into her mother's sense of herself that she no longer knew how to speak. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat in the darkness with the letter, reading it again and again, absorbing new details with each reading, understanding her life in reverse. She thought about Thomas, whoever he had become. She thought about whether he had found peace in his absence or simply traded one form of pain for another. She thought about the letter he might have received from their mother, if the envelope had ever reached him, and whether it would have explained anything at all. By morning, Margaret had made a decision. She would not honor the system that had produced this letter. She would not maintain the silence. She would not pretend that the drawer was just an old drawer and the hidden compartment was just a curiosity, and the letter was simply her mother's private regret. She would find Thomas, or she would at least try, and she would tell him that someone, finally, had decided to dismantle the architecture of lies. She called a number written in faded pencil. A woman answered on the second ring, speaking quickly, asking if this was about the contractor. Margaret apologized and hung up. She made calls to her mother's oldest friend, a woman named Eleanor, who had visited regularly throughout her mother's final years. Eleanor did not know about Thomas specifically, but she remembered that Margaret's mother had sometimes spoken about a son who had moved away. He was always very intelligent, Eleanor said. Your mother was very proud of him, though she rarely said so directly. I always thought it was a shame, the distance between them. Margaret hired a private investigator. It felt ridiculous and perhaps excessive, but she had reached a point where the small embarrassment of hiring someone paled in comparison to the urgency of finding her brother. The investigator called her 3 weeks later. Thomas was alive. He was 51 years old. He worked as a teacher in a town 4 hours away, teaching literature at a high school, living alone, maintaining no social media presence. He had never married. He had no children. His life was small and contained and deliberate, the kind of life a person might construct if they were very carefully managing their own solitude. Margaret did not call immediately. She sat with this information for several days, understanding that once she made contact, everything would change. She would have to explain the letter, the hidden compartment, the drawer that had kept its secrets for decades. She would have to ask forgiveness on behalf of Mother, who had already died and could not ask for it herself. She would have to open a wound that had been carefully sealed all these years. But she did it anyway. She called on a Thursday evening, when she calculated that Thomas would be home from work, but not yet deep into the evening. A man answered. His voice was exactly like she remembered it from her childhood, though deeper now, more weathered. "Is this Thomas?" she asked. There was a long pause. "Who is asking?" "It's Margaret, your sister." Another pause, longer this time. In that silence, Margaret could hear the weight of 40 years collapsing into a single moment. "Our mother died 8 months ago," Margaret said, before he could hang up. "I found something in her bedroom. I found a letter. I found." Her voice broke slightly. "I found proof that you were telling the truth, that you were always telling the truth, and she made you leave anyway." Thomas did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was very quiet. "I don't know if I'm ready for this conversation." "I know," Margaret said, "but I thought you should know that someone finally believes you. Someone in the family finally knows what actually happened." They talked for 3 hours that night. Margaret read portions of the letter to him. Thomas cried in a way that Margaret realized he probably had not allowed himself to cry in a very long time. She cried, too, for the child she had been, for the brother she never really knew, for the mother who had made impossible choices, and then lived with the consequences. Thomas told her things about their childhood that Margaret had blocked out or refused to understand. He described moments of violence and rage that had shaped his entire life, that had made him careful and fearful and ultimately solitary. "I always thought," Thomas said at one point, "that if I just stayed away, if I just lived quietly and didn't bother anyone, maybe I could convince myself that it wasn't real, that I had imagined it all. But I didn't imagine it. And part of me knew all along that I hadn't. Part of me was just waiting for someone to confirm it." "I'm confirming it," Margaret said. "The entire truth. All of it. I believe you." Thomas came to the house 2 weeks later. It was the first time he had been there in 34 years. He walked through the room slowly, reacquainted himself with spaces that had shaped him in ways he had spent decades trying to forget. He went into the bedroom where the drawer still sat, open, the hidden compartment exposed. He looked at it for a very long time. "She kept the letter," he said. "All these years, she kept the letter. She couldn't give it to you," Margaret said, "but she couldn't destroy it either. That seems like the most honest thing about her. Somehow, the fact that she couldn't fully commit to either choice." They spent the afternoon in that room, talking about their parents, about the choices people make and the cost of those choices. Thomas picked up the original letter with careful, reverent hands, the way you might handle a document of great historical importance. In a way, it was one. It was a document that explained how silence gets maintained, how families fracture, how the architecture of denial can hold up for decades before finally beginning to crumble. "What will you do with this?" Thomas asked. Margaret had thought about this question many times. "I think I'll keep it. Not hidden, but kept, as a record of what actually happened. Not for display. Not as a way to damage her memory, but as a way to make sure that this version of events is remembered. The true version." They decided to go for the house together, to sort through their mother's possessions not as an estate sale, but as an archaeological expedition. They found other things hidden in other places, journals that their mother had written in secret, detailed accounts of incidents that confirmed everything the letter had described. They found photographs of Thomas as a child, hidden in envelopes at the back of drawers, as if their mother had been unable to completely erase the evidence of his early existence. Each discovery was like another brick being removed from the wall of silence that had defined their family. It took them 3 months to sort through everything. By the end, they had created a comprehensive archive, not for public consumption, but for themselves, a record of what had really happened, a way of honoring the truth that their mother had tried so hard to bury. Thomas talked about his life, the ways it had been shaped by those early years, the ways he had tried to compensate through solitude and quiet living. Margaret talked about her own life, the ways she had tried to prove that she was nothing like her father, the ways she had inherited the silence even though she had not experienced the original violence. On the last day before Thomas left, they stood together in front of the dresser. The drawer was closed now, but Margaret opened it one final time. The hidden compartment was still visible, the replaced with grain still subtly different from the original. Thomas reached out and touched it. "Do you know what I realized?" he said. "She was as much a prisoner as I was. Maybe more. She was locked inside with it every day, inside those walls, inside that marriage. At least I got to escape. She tried," Margaret said. "In the end, she tried to tell you. She just couldn't do it while she was alive." "It's something," Thomas said. He left that afternoon, driving back to his quiet house, his quiet life. But something had changed. They exchanged phone numbers. They talked every Sunday evening, conversations that were sometimes stilted but always real, always attempting to build something that had been destroyed decades ago. Margaret began researching family history, understanding the generational patterns of trauma and silence that had made her father who he was, that had made her mother who she was, that had made Thomas who he was. She understood that healing was not about forgiveness, exactly, but about acknowledgement. It was about saying, this happened, this was real, and now we know it was real. 6 months after she found the letter, Margaret returned to work at the university. She began a special project, cataloging collections related to family history and trauma narratives. She worked with people whose families had been separated by violence, by circumstance, by deliberate choice. She helped them organize their own hidden letters, their own secret documents, their own carefully maintained silences. She became an expert in the archaeology of family secrets. People would ask her why she was so passionate about this particular work. She would smile and say it was personal. She would not elaborate, but internally, she understood that she was building a kind of monument to the drawer that had changed everything. She was saying, the truth matters. What happens in the dark matters. The stories we tell ourselves about our families matter enormously, and they should be told carefully, honestly, completely. Thomas eventually became more present. He visited more often. They took photographs together, documenting their tentative, careful reconciliation. These photographs would go into the archive alongside everything else, a record of two people learning to trust each other after 40 years of enforced distance. The drawer itself remained in the dresser. Margaret could not bring herself to remove it or repair it. It was a physical reminder of what hiding looks like, of what silence costs, of the price we pay when we decide that peace is more important than truth. There was a particular kind of silence that had filled that house for generations, the silence of unsaid things, the silence of violence transformed into politeness, the silence of children protecting their parents by accepting blame for their own abandonment. But that silence had finally been broken, and in breaking, it had allowed something else to emerge. Not happiness, exactly, not simple reconciliation, but honesty, difficult, painful, necessary honesty, and the kind of healing that only comes when someone finally says, I believe you. I believe what you experienced. I believe the truth. The drawer remained. The hidden compartment remained, but it no longer held secrets. There are moments in life when you understand that everything you believed about yourself has been constructed on a foundation of incomplete truths. Margaret stood in the kitchen of her mother's house. Her house now, though she still thought of it as belonging to someone else, and made the same tea that her mother had made for 40 years. The kettle whistled. The steam rose. The afternoon light moved across the counter in the exact same angle it always had. But everything was different. Everything was utterly transformed because someone, finally, had decided to look closely at what had been hidden. The letter was now framed, not in a prominent place, not somewhere guests would see it, but in the study, on a shelf among other documents, other records, other pieces of the archaeological reconstruction of her family's truth. Thomas had suggested this. He had said that hiding it again would be betraying the courage it took for their mother to write it in the first place. Margaret understood that he was right. Even though the act of displaying that letter felt like a violation of privacy, like a breaking of trust. But perhaps, she thought, that breaking of trust was long overdue. Perhaps the only way to honor her mother's final confession was to stop treating it as a secret. She and Thomas had developed a ritual. Every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, they spoke on the telephone. Not long conversations necessarily, but consistent ones. Steady, a rebuilding of connection that had been severed 3 decades earlier. Thomas had taken leave from his teaching position for 2 weeks, the first significant break he had taken in 15 years. He used that time to help Margaret organize the house, to go through their parents' possessions with the care of archaeologists, to document everything that might matter later. They found their mother's journals, as mentioned, but they also found something else, photographs that had been carefully hidden. Images of Thomas as a child, at birthday parties, at school events, moments that their mother had seemingly erased from official family history, but could not bring herself to actually destroy. Each photograph was like a piece of a person being reclaimed from the debris of the past. Thomas would hold these photographs carefully, studying his own face at different ages, sometimes recognizing himself in those eyes, and sometimes wondering who that child had been. "She kept these," he said once, holding a photograph of himself at age 10, standing in front of a birthday cake. "She kept these the whole time, even though she told everyone I didn't matter. She was trying to exist in two realities simultaneously," Margaret said. "The one where you had to be sent away, the one where the family story made sense, and the one where you were her son, and she loved you, and she was proud of you. She couldn't reconcile those two realities while she was alive. So she kept the evidence of both hidden, hoping maybe someone would find it eventually and understand." "I'm not sure I understand," Thomas said, "but I'm beginning to accept it." That, Margaret realized, might be all that was possible. Understanding requires the kind of complete knowledge that we can never have about another person's interior life. But acceptance is something we can work toward. It's something we can choose consciously, deliberately, every single day. Margaret made a decision to keep the house. She had inherited it. But she might have sold it, might have tried to excise this place from her life as cleanly as her father had been excised from family conversation. Instead, she decided that the house should become a record. Not a museum, exactly, not a mausoleum, but a place where the truth of what had happened could be acknowledged and preserved. She created a study that contained copies of all the documents, all the journals, all the photographs. She labeled them carefully, methodically, the way an archivist would. She made notes about provenance, about dates, about the context of each piece. Thomas asked her once if she was afraid that people would judge their parents based on these records. "Of course," Margaret said. "People will judge them. They should judge them. But they should judge them based on what actually happened, not on the carefully constructed fiction that our family maintained for decades." And there's something almost important about that, isn't there? About saying, this is who they were, this is what they did, these are the choices they made. We can acknowledge that without condemning them entirely. We can understand how trauma perpetuates itself, how fear makes people do terrible things, how the desire to maintain a certain image can corrupt everything. Thomas nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. "I spent 34 years trying to forget that I came from this place, try and construct an identity that had nothing to do with this house, this family, these people. But I realize now that I can't forget it. And maybe I shouldn't try. Maybe the point isn't to escape the past, but to understand it, to integrate it, to say, yes, this happened to me, and it shaped me, and here I am anyway, still alive, still capable of connection, still trying." Margaret hugged her brother that night, something she had not done since they were children. He was stiff at first, uncomfortable with the physical intimacy, but then he relaxed into it. And for a moment, they were not two middle-aged people reconstructing a broken family. They were simply siblings, holding each other in the aftermath of terrible truths finally spoken aloud. The drawer remained in the dresser. The hidden compartment remained exposed. Margaret never repaired it. She left it as evidence, as testimony, as a physical manifestation of what happens when people try to hide the things that demand to be seen. Sometimes people would ask about it, friends, colleagues, family friends who came to the house. Margaret would explain it simply. "It's where my mother hid a letter, a very important letter. I left it broken intentionally, as a reminder that the truth cannot stay hidden forever." People had different reactions to this explanation. Some seemed troubled by it, as if the broken drawer represented a kind of violation of privacy, a refusal to let the dead rest peacefully. But others, particularly those who had their own family secrets, their own hidden wounds, seemed to understand immediately what Margaret was attempting. They would look at the drawer with a kind of recognition, as if seeing their own silences reflected back at them. Margaret began to speak publicly about her work. She gave talks at conferences about family archives and trauma narratives. She wrote articles about the importance of documentation, about how historical truth is constructed through careful attention to detail and evidence. She did not always mention her own family story, but it informed everything she said. It was a foundation of her understanding that the past is not actually past, that it lives in drawers and envelopes and hidden compartments, that it shapes every decision we make in the present. 1 year after finding the letter, Margaret organized an exhibition. It was not about her family specifically, though her story was threaded through it. Instead, it was a broader examination of family secrets, of hidden truths, of the ways that silence perpetuates trauma across generations. She worked with other archivists, other researchers, other people who had their own broken drawers and hidden letters. Together, they created something powerful, not a condemnation of the past, but an acknowledgement of it, a way of saying, "We see you, we believe you, your truth matters." Thomas attended the opening of the exhibition. He stood in front of a display case that contained a reproduction of his mother's letter, and Margaret watched him read it again, even though he had read it dozens of times by now. She understood that he was not reading the letter so much as communing with it, acknowledging his own journey through the words she had written. "Do you think she would have approved?" Thomas asked Margaret that evening, after the exhibition had closed, and they were walking through the rooms alone. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I think she would have been terrified. And then, gradually, she would have come to understand that this was the only way, that hiding the truth meant hiding herself, and that maybe, finally, being seen, even in all her complexity and contradiction and failure, was worth the risk." They sat together in the study, where the original letter was displayed. The house was quiet around them, the same quality of silence Margaret had felt when she first found the drawer. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the silence of secrets, but the silence of completion, the silence of something finally being at rest after decades of agitation. "Thank you," Thomas said, "for breaking the silence." "Thank you," Margaret replied, "for surviving it." They sat there as darkness fell outside the windows, the city lights beginning to glow in the distance. The drawer remained visible in the bedroom upstairs, broken and honest, a permanent reminder that what is hidden eventually demands to be seen, that the truth, no matter how long it has been buried, eventually finds a way to resurface, that silence, passed down through generations, can finally be broken by someone who is brave enough to look carefully at what was meant to remain unseen. The story of what happened in that house, what happened in that family, did not end with revelation. It continued, evolved, became something more complex and more human than anyone had anticipated. It became a story not about shame, but about the possibility of transformation, not about judgment, but about understanding, not about condemning the dead, but about honoring the truth of their lives while also honoring the lives of those they had damaged. And in kitchens around the city, in offices and homes and quiet corners of libraries, other people were beginning to look more carefully at their own drawers, to examine their own hidden compartments, to ask themselves, what truth have I been carrying? What silence have I been maintaining? What would happen if I finally decided to look? The drawer had changed everything, not because it contained something extraordinary, but because it contained something true. And sometimes, in a world built on careful omissions and strategic forgetting, the simple act of telling the truth is the most radical thing a person can do.